2 weeks ago, a really good friend and I were having beers in the late evening, and he said to me, asked this question. He said, Malcolm, what do you think of this question? The question of, are we living in a computer simulation? In other words, are we like those office workers in the 1999 movie, The Matrix? The philosopher Nick Bostrom wrestles with this question, and he refers to an idea in the philosophy of mind called substrate independence. And what this proposes is that although today our sense of self depends on biological processes, it may one day be possible to download one's consciousness onto a machine. So we had a long conversation about it, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. And I'm going to just tell you that I may be entirely wrong about this, but I do not at all believe this to be the case. The metaphor of our mind as a kind of computer is very powerful in our time, but we are not computers. We are bodies, not just minds. We are spirit, too. That story about unwittingly inhabiting a world within a computer is in some respects the exact opposite of the Christmas story. Christmas is about the absolute dignity of every human body and the way that God chooses to be intimately connected to the world, even through a humble and vulnerable and poor family. In Muriel Rukeyser's poem, The Speed of Darkness, she writes, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. On this holy night, when the sacred and the secular meet, it is time to wake up to the story that we are living, to let ourselves be touched by a story that pulls us beyond where we are right now, a story from God." Our former dean, Alan Jones, used to ask, what story have you been telling yourself? What happens when the story stops or becomes too painful? And I think of my own personal story this evening about people I loved who died this year, despite my illusion that they would live forever. I think of the story of our culture. It seems like the American dream has been replaced by a kind of nightmare of scarcity and decay. We have come to believe that everything is falling apart, so we sadly talk about becoming great again, as if our whole society were like a high school football star whose only accomplishment occurred a lifetime ago. If we can't help being caught up in a story, which one will it be? Truman Capote's book, Other Voices, Other Rooms, features a 13-year-old character named Joel Knox. So after Joel's mother died, he prays to God, oh God, let me be loved." And the good news of Christmas is that you are. You are loved by God. Mary loved her baby without reservation, and that is how God loves you. You are the place where the story of God happens. The writer Frederick Buechner wonders what it would be like if God's existence became suddenly and completely clear. So he has kind of a thought experiment. He imagines God like changing and brightening the stars in the Milky Way and kind of rearranging them all so that on one occasion they say, God exists, or God is. And you can imagine that the first night when these stars arrange themselves in that way, you can imagine people looking into that vast expanse of the night sky. You can imagine them falling to their knees in shock. They might wonder, am I living in a computer simulation? We would seek out explanations from astronomers and physicists. Social media influencers would go crazy. Some of us would think, if only I had known this all along, I would have done things differently. And perhaps a dying person would see this from his or her hospital window and feel a renewed sense of hope. And at first, it would be the only thing we talked about. It would have a massive effect on our lives. Every day, the churches would overflow. It would be like this every day. People would stop killing each other in Ukraine. the Holy Land, Somalia, and Sudan. But over time, people would get used to this display in the night sky. And maybe even to keep their attention, God would kind of start to change it up a little bit, maybe using different colors or writing the same words in different languages. But even that would not be enough, would it? Because eventually, people would become indifferent to it. And so Buechner imagines a child turning to her father and saying, "So what if God exists? What difference does that make?" We all want to be certain about God, and some kind of scientific proof sure would be nice. But in the long run, we need more than to know that God exists. It is not the objective proof of God's existence that we want, but the experience of God's presence. That is the miracle that we really desire. And I believe it is the miracle that we actually receive. I don't talk about it much, but after college, I lived on the beach in Marina del Rey, Southern California, just south of Santa Monica. And every evening, I would go running in my bare feet on the wet sand. And as the breakers rolled in and the light faded on the Santa Monica mountains, I used to see the most magnificent sunsets, brilliant colors in the distant horsetail clouds. And then sometimes you'd see a flash of the moonlight in the crashing waves. And let me tell you, there's 13 million people who live in Los Angeles, and I was pretty much alone every night. God was speaking, but I passed hundreds of windows with people sitting inside watching their televisions. God is speaking tonight, too. God speaks in a deeply personal and individual way through people and events. Who knows what God might tell you on a holy night like this? It could be a message that makes all the difference. So let me talk about 3 kinds of moments when we experience God's presence most acutely. First, I believe that every person, and I don't know, we don't talk about this because it's embarrassing, but every person periodically experiences a kind of emptiness, a sense that life is hollow. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called this anxiety. Martin Heidegger referred to the unheimlich, or the uncanny. Jean-Paul Sartre called it anguish. Other 20th century existentialist philosophers called it dread. It's the sense that something's missing in our lives, an incompleteness. God speaks to us through silences like this. But most of us, we turn away from quietness or anything that feels uncomfortable. And often, this means that we miss the still small voice within. Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World imagines a dystopian future world culture which values social stability above all else. And so people are born out of bottles and raised in groups to fit into a rigid social hierarchy. So there are no families, no mothers or fathers or siblings. There are no close relatives or husbands or wives. There's a lot of sexual promiscuity and shallow distraction, and no one ages. The government basically conditions them all to hate solitude. And when anyone feels a twinge of unhappiness or the emptiness I just described, they quickly take a drug called soma, which puts them into a happy dream state. Now, near the end of the story, Mustafa Mond, one of the world controllers, explains everything. He explains that solitude and age often lead us to encounter God. When people age, he says, quote, and the passions grow calm, our reason becomes less troubled in its workings, less obscured by the images, desires, and distractions in which it used to be absorbed. And God emerges as from behind a cloud. Our soul feels, sees, turns toward the source of all light. Sometimes I wonder that as we spend more time in our headphones, we are no longer experiencing enough of the silence that leads us to God. The second way that God communicates to us is through our ordinary life. God speaks about how we should be and what we should do. And you may have noticed this yourself. There's a little voice inside of us that gives us a sense of what we should be doing. And you may have noticed that little voice when you take pleasure when something bad happens to a friend who has hurt us, or when someone makes a funny but unkind joke and everyone around us laughs. In these moments of discomfort, we hear a voice that comes from God, that tells us what's right and what is true. And in regular life also, the ordinary weapon warfare of our days, we suddenly become aware of angels. Alexander Schmemann was an Orthodox priest and a writer, and he told a group of students that as a young man living in Paris, he was riding the metro one day with his fiancée, and the two of them were just absolutely and totally in love. They loved each other so much, and they were kind of in their own world. And the train stopped, and an elderly, very ugly-looking old woman got on. And she was wearing a Salvation Army uniform, and she sat not too far from them. So the young lovers whispered to each other in Russian, talking about how ugly she was. At the next stop, the woman got up, and as she walked past the young couple, she said in perfect Russian, "I wasn't always ugly." And for Schmemann, that was an angel of God who shocked him into seeing that what was in front of him was far more than merely an ugly old woman. She changed the way that he encountered everyone else who came after her, and he gave him practice in searching for those angelic presences. Finally, this is tough to say too, but God speaks to us in tragedy. And by this I mean both national tragedies and our own personal tragedies too. The cruelty, ignorance, and greed in our country right now should remind all of us how important it is to always insist on treating every human being with dignity. We need to wake up to God's truth that we are one human family. As I said, it's been a difficult year. My father-in-law, Glenn, my nephew, Keone, my close clergy friend, Beth, my lifetime friend and groomsman, Nick, along with even our dog, Poppy, died. And I miss them, each of them, profoundly. Each had a role in my life and a connection to me that no one else ever had and no one else ever would. And it's been hard to be my naturally joyful self. But I've had help. God has given me a sense of gratitude for each of these people, an understanding of how precious everyone I encounter is. In one of the Apostle Paul's last letters, he writes from prison knowing that he is on his way to death in Rome. And in this bleak situation, strangely enough, he writes this: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. The Lord is near, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ." Now, even at this year, I don't know if you feel this, but I definitely do. I almost feel like Christmas is a kind of time machine. It brings back every other Christmas that we've ever had. And I can even just see my mother-in-law, and the first time I ever went to church with her, coming in at this service. In 2015, she came down the main aisle and heard me preach for the first time. We had communion together for the first time. Let me tell you, looking out at all of you, I have to say that if this is a computer simulation, I love it. I'm grateful for the world made of stories, not of atoms, that God lets us be loved, that we are the place where the story of God happens. The words that God speaks to us, these are the real miracles. And they're not the kind of miracles that create faith, but the miracles that it takes faith to see. Despite the daily news, filled with examples of cruelty, greed, and ignorance, despite even the death of so many of my loved ones, this is what God says in my heart: the Lord is near. Do not be afraid. Rejoice.